Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's event from the Jesus College Intellectual Forum as part of the Cambridge Festival. It's great to have you with us, whether you are here in this wonderful Frankopan Hall or you're watching us online, wherever in the world you may be, you're very welcome. My name's Julian Huppert, and I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum here. Now, I know some of you know Jesus incredibly well. For some of you, this may be your first time here, and you're welcome either way. But just very briefly, while people file in, we have a history that dates back to 1144, when a small plot of land was given by Nigel, Bishop of Ely, to a small group of itinerant nuns. And that nunnery then developed. In the 1156, King Malcolm IV of Scotland authorised the grant of the rest of the land around here to the college. I still don't quite understand why this was part of Scotland, but apparently it was. I'm sure somebody will explain later. And then in 1496, the new Bishop of Ely decided to see how things were going. And he reported that there were two nuns left. One of them was rather elderly, and the other was of ill fame, which you can interpret how you'd like to. And so he kicked all the women out and turned into an all-male college, something we have since corrected. And since that time, there have been many brilliant people who have lived and worked here, who've really influenced thought and culture around the world. One can think recently about Clean Bandit and Rockabye, Lisa Jardine, who was absolutely inspirational in so many areas. One could go back to people like Cranmer and Malthus, or Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who we'll hear a bit more about today. You also may have seen that one of his writings, a very important poem, is available for sale. And if anyone would like to buy it for about £20,000 and donate it to the college, we would be very, very grateful. Just let me or almost anyone else here know when we're done. We have a range of brilliant people in the college, and we're going to hear from one of them tonight, one of our star college postdoctoral associates. It's been wonderful to have, it's been wonderful to have Mathelinda Nabugodi here with us as a CPDA. She does have a day job, which is at Fitzwilliam Museum, not the college, but the museum, looking at the archives there. We're going to hear about Romanticism and Coleridge and others, but also particularly from the perspective of the Black Atlantic and how that fits in. So we'll hear from you, and then we'll have some questions. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming here on this, well, actually quite mild Tuesday evening. Thank you, Julian, for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm quite unused to the format where half of you are on one side of me and the other half on the other side. I'll try to look at all of you in the course today. So the talk is called Romanticism in the Black Atlantic. It grows from my current book project, which is called The Trembling Hand, Reflections of a Black Woman in the Romantic Archive. I'm the Black woman. I have worked on Romanticism for basically my entire academic career, so around about 15 years now, and recently I've been thinking about what it means to me, for me as a Black woman, specifically as a Black woman, to do that. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, excellent. So I'm going to begin with a bit of definition of terms, and the first term is Romanticism, which I symbolize with this painting by Caspar David Friedrich, a German painter. It's called The Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog, and I see some smiling nods. This painting, in very many ways, encapsulates what Romanticism is all about. They're into nature, they're into sublime landscapes. Almost invariably, those landscapes are the landscapes of Northern Europe. So they're not into the tropics. This is what sublimity is like. Those landscapes are symbolizing the freedom of the human mind, the way in which we can imagine things that we cannot physically conquer. This is why this man is facing backwards. He's a placeholder for us, so we're supposed to imagine ourselves in his position. But invariably, that is the position of a white man. So it comes with this assumption that the human mind's imaginings, the imagination, is best presented in the shape of a white man. And this is why I begin thinking about Romanticism as a Black woman, how they relate to a movement that universalizes a very particular experience that's very far away from my own experience. So those are the grand themes of Romantic thought that I'm engaging with. I also want to give you a bit of a timeline. Romanticism is often dated to begin with 1789, with the French Revolution, because that was really a revolution of everything, not just the political system in France, but it was a revolution in how we perceive our place in the world, in the relationship between man and nature, man and society, also within the family, between husband and wife, between children and parents. And because Romanticism deals both with freedom in an imaginative sense, so the freedom of the creative imagination, but also with political freedom. That's, again, why the French Revolution is a key starting point. But for us in Britain, 1789 is also the year that William Wilberforce, the abolitionist, for the first time presented a bill for the abolition of the slave trade. So not slavery, but the slave trade. And that's the same year as the French Revolution. And it's, by and large, because of the revolution that this bill didn't get anywhere, because the revolution was such a radical event that people were like, no, this is too crazy. Emancipation, not at all. So that's kind of why it also derailed that process. Now, Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, so quite a bit later. And just to be, again, emphasized, it's the abolition of the slave trade. It's not the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. It also only regarded the legal trafficking of Africans by British ships. Of course, there was still illegal trafficking going on, and there were, of course, the other European nations, as well as the United States, that continued to traffic in Africans. Now, to return to Romanticism, the end of Romanticism is often set to 1832, which in the UK is the passage of the Great Reform Act, which did a lot to widen the franchise. So because it, again, transformed the social settlement, that's why it's seen as an endpoint of Romanticism and then the beginning of the Victorian era. The Great Reform Act paved the way for the abolition of slavery as well. With a widened franchise, there were more people who were against it. And so in 1839, slavery was abolished in the British Empire. Now, I'm showing you this timeline because I want to see how neatly it overlaps. The beginning and end of Romanticism on the one hand, and then the beginning and end of the debates around abolition, and then finally passage of abolition. So during the Romantic period, slavery was one of the big things that was being debated in Parliament, but also on the streets. And yet often when we study Romanticism, those two things are not really brought in context, which might seem really surprising, but actually it took me 10 years of academic study before I made those links myself. And I think that says more about how Romanticism is being taught in English departments than anything else. So my book aims to reveal the links between the poetry of Romanticism, which celebrates freedom and liberty, and the practice of slavery in that period that saw the birth and height of the racial capitalism that still structures global inequalities today. Which brings me to my second key term today, the Black Atlantic. Now this is an 18th century map. We see Britain, yellow at the top. Here you have Africa and the Americas. I use the term Black Atlantic as a shorthand for the effects of the transatlantic slave trade on the continents around the Atlantic Rim, so Europe, West Africa, and the Americas. The primary effect I'm interested in is the advent of racial thinking. Slavery has existed in Europe and Africa since antiquity, but in those days, slavery was not connected to race. In fact, the very concept of race as a scientific category was invented and developed alongside the traffic in humans with a darker skin. So my argument is that racism, ideas about racial superiority or inferiority, were invented by Europeans in order to justify the slave trade and slave-run plantation economies in the Americas. That said, I'm not a historian of slavery per se, I'm a scholar of literature. My interest lies in examining how the enslavement of Africans fed into developing the concepts of race and racism in sciences, but more importantly for me, in arts and culture. That is, I approach racism as an intellectual formation that emerged to justify enslavement of Africans, and I'm particularly interested in how it affected literature and the arts. And that is the purpose of my book. So I'm going to share some of the material that I'm working on today, but before delving into the Romantic era materials, I want to offer you a remark on language, and especially the N-word. Because when you deal with 18th and 19th century discourses about Africans, you encounter the N-word a lot. Now, my policy is when I see it in a citation, I do read it, but I don't use it in my own writing, and I don't use it in my own the things that are coming from me, I'm not using that word. I also do want to point out that it is an offensive term today, but it was also an offensive term already then. And to offer you some evidence for that, I'm going to show you a citation by John Newton. Now, John Newton is best known today as the author of the hymn Amazing Grace. And that is the church we used to preach, where there's now a stained glass window celebrating him as well as the hymn. But before he became a minister and hymn writer, he was first a sailor in the slave trade and then a captain on slave trade ships. During a particularly perilous journey, his ship was badly damaged, and barely made it back to port. And that's when he had his religious epiphany, and that's what made him religious, and then eventually became a minister, an abolitionist. He published a book called Thoughts Upon the African Slave Trade, in which he drew upon his experiences as a slaver to attack the institution of slavery. At the outset of the book, he writes that he will consider the African trade, first with regards to the effects it has on our own people, and secondly, as it concerns the blacks, or, as they are more contemptuously styled, the Negro slaves whom we purchased upon the coast. So I single out this quote because it highlights that already then, this is in the 1780s, the word Negro is a contemptuous epithet. It's not a neutral description. So when people use it already back then, they are using a word that is a racial slur. So the reason why I do read it nonetheless, even though it is offensive then and now, is because I don't want to censor that. I don't want to whitewash or cover over how offensive the language was. Now, a second reason for me to single out this quote is because he says first, he's considering the effect on British sailors, and second, he considers the effect on Africans. And that's very common in abolitionist writing. They're more concerned with conditions for British sailors during the Middle Passage than they are necessarily for the Africans being enslaved. And that's something we'll see more of in this talk today. Okay, so that was a bit of a note of language. Now let's move into the meat of the matter, which is the substance of the talk today. My book is situated in the archives of the major Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats. Today I will focus on my work on Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was a graduate of Jesus College. Actually, no, not a graduate. He was a student, but he never graduated. He was here in the early 1790s, and here's a picture of him from 1795, so just after he left college. Now, each chapter in the book is structured around an object found in the archive. The object at the heart of the Coleridge chapter is this ledger, which is from Jesus College. So this is what is now the old library, what was then just the college library. This ledger was in use in the 1790s, in which students recorded the books they took out and when they returned them. It's hard to see, but here you see Coleridge borrowing Aeschylus twice. He returned it once, and the second time is just a question mark. It's an interesting object because, of course, it allows us to study the reading of students at the time, and to a certain extent, because the same names appear again and again, we can trace their intellectual development. But it also has its own history. As you can see, there's this white patch in the center. That is because people who were really into Coleridge, predominantly in the Victorian period, would cut out his name out of the ledger to keep it, as an autograph, basically. And there's even an example of one of those slips being cut out of this ledger, then ending up in an auction for literary manuscripts. And that fascinates me, how people consider names and handwriting, and particularly a famous poet's handwriting, to be something valuable, something that has a cash value beyond whatever information you might gain about that person's writing. So as mentioned, I didn't mention that. This is the first page, this is the letter A, and here we see Coleridge taking out Aeschylus, the great tragedian. He did so preparing to write a Greek ode in competition for the 1792 Brown Medal. Now, the Brown Medal was an annual competition in which people got to write one ode in Sapphic Greek and another ode in Horatian Latin, and the best ode would win a gold medal and some money. Now, Coleridge came up in 1791, and he immediately started preparing to compete in that competition the following year. The topic for that year, the topic was chosen by the Vice Chancellor of the University, so it was centrally set, and everyone had to write for the same topic. In 1792, the topic was announced in January. Here's the Cambridge Chronicle in which it was announced. The topic was in Latin, Sors Misera Servorum in Insulis India Occidentalis, or in English, The Unhappy Fate of the Slaves in the West Indian Islands. Now, as I mentioned, Wilberforce presents the Bill for the Abolition of the Slave Trade for the first time in 1789. In 1792, he's preparing to present it for the third time. So this topic about the miseries of slavery was very much something being debated in Parliament and again in newspapers and taverns all over the place. So Coleridge wrote a poem on this theme, and he also won the prize. In addition to the money, he got to transcribe his poem into this very fancy ledger, which is now in Cambridge University Library. It was used only for the people who had won the prize to transcribe their winning poems. So I think he must have been so proud when he did this. And he did it at commencement in summer, so in early July, quite often. You get to transcribe your poem, you get to recite it in front of the assembled fellows of the university. So this was really the height of his undergraduate career. Now, this ode exists in 2 copies. One is this one, which he transcribed into the official ledger at the university. The other one was in the news just the other week, which Julian already mentioned. Here's the press release. This is a copy that Coleridge transcribed to his elder brother George. So Coleridge's father passed away when he was quite young, so George was very much like his substitute father at the time. So he was very proud of himself. He transcribed his prize-winning poem and he sent it to his brother George. That had stayed in the family until fairly recently, so it passed down by descent, but now just last summer it was sold to someone who's abroad. What you see here is a press release published last week on gov.uk by the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. So now this manuscript is at risk of leaving the country. So what's the context here? Well, when a potentially significant work of art, manuscript, or other cultural object is sold to a foreign purchaser, an export license must be obtained. As part of this process, experts in the field may make an objection to the issuing of such a license on the grounds of the object being a national treasure, such that its departure from the UK would be a misfortune. And that's actually what it says, the legal text. It's a misfortune to the nation. When this happens, a government-appointed committee meets to consider the case, and in the case of the Greek ode, an export ban was issued. In the press release, which you see here, one of the committee members, his name is Peter Barber, said, "This insignificant-seeming, annotated draft of a poem in Greek is an emotive relic of one of this country's greatest poets and sages. Its content reflects his heartfelt and lifelong commitment to one of the burning national issues of the time, the abolition of slavery," and he continued to refer to the poem throughout his life. So this is why this poem is important. Even though the paper as such is not very big, it's a letter. It's quite stained. It's in Greek, it's legible. Or for us who do not have Greek, it's almost legible. And yet, because it was Coleridge, but also because it has to do with abolition, it has to do with those debates around abolition, that's why it is a national treasure. The Arts and Heritage Minister, Lord Parkinson of Whitley Bay, seconded this point. He also says, "This fascinating manuscript offers an insight into the early thinking of one of Britain's greatest poets, particularly on the debates around abolition," again emphasizing both the importance of Coleridge, but also the importance of this history, and the fact this manuscript brings them together, the Romantic poet and the Black Atlantic. "I sincerely hope that a UK buyer can be found to ensure that it can remain here in the UK, where it can be studied and enjoyed by future generations," he concludes. Well, so let's study it a little bit and take a bit of a closer look. What you have here on the image is the first 4 stanzas, 16 lines. What you have on the other side is Coleridge's own translation into English of those first 4 stanzas. Now, I'll just read it out to you, and it's hard to, I'll do my best. "Leaving the gates of darkness, O death, hasten thou to a race yoked to misery. Thou wilt not be received with lacerations of cheeks, nor with funeral ululation, but on the contrary with circling dances and the joy of songs. Thou art terrible indeed, yet thou dwellest with liberty, stern Lord. Borne on thy dark pinions across the rough swelling of the wide ocean, they fly to the loved seats of joys and to their native country. There by the side of fountains, beneath citron groves, the lovers tell their beloved what kind of horrors, being men, they had endured from men." Perhaps this last line rings a bell for some of you. The final line is straight out of Aeschylus, his drama Prometheus Bound, where Prometheus has just been strung up to rock in Caucasus and complains of what he, a god, has endured from the gods. In fact, anyone well-versed in Greek poetry would recognize that this ode is a patchwork of citations from various classical authors. And that gives a hint to the ode's composition principle. We tend to associate poetry with genius and originality, which is, of course, an idea propagated by the Romantics. Therefore, Coleridge's method for composing this may surprise us. He did not imagine words, he didn't pull them out of his imagination. Instead, he first conceived of an idea, and then he hunted through the different books he had borrowed from the library to find the appropriate lines, words, and sentences in which to address those ideas. So when you can see his reading, we can actually literally see the materials of his poem. This is no mere plagiarism, however. Adopting found materials to express his own ideas is a creative challenge. Taken together, these borrowed words express ideas not found in the Greek models. For instance, the notion that enslaved Africans, the race yoked to misery of the opening line, will receive death with circling dances and the joy of songs refers to contemporary understandings of African beliefs about ancestors and afterlife. Mortality was extremely high in the transatlantic passage and on slave plantations. Some British commentators blamed this on the Africans themselves. They would complain that Africans were inherently suicidal because they believed that dying would entail a return home to Africa. Abolitionists magnified this argument to point to the horrors of slavery. So Coleridge himself said, in order to explain this passage, that, and this is quoting Coleridge, the slaves in the West Indies consider death as a passport to their native country, end quote. So again, on one hand, all the words come from the classics, but the ideas are very contemporary, and they show Coleridge's knowledge of abolitionist literature. While this prose might seem rather stilted to us, most of Coleridge's contemporaries appreciated the sublime vigor with which it expressed Coleridge's sentiments. Even later in life, long after he had become famous, Coleridge would return to this ode and brag about his early achievement. But when he does so, or when you read Coleridge bragging about being a student abolitionist, it's important to remember that he was here at Jesus on a Rostad scholarship. Those had been endowed by Tobias Rostad, a 17th century courtier, diplomat, and benefactor of various charitable causes, but also an investor in the Royal African Company. And the Royal African Company is the single institution that shipped more enslaved Africans into American slavery than any other throughout the whole period of the transatlantic slave trade. Rostad was not only an investor, he was also involved in the governance as one of its assistants, or we might say directors in contemporary parlance. So even as young Coleridge was writing odes against slavery and winning prizes for it, his studies were partially financed by proceeds from someone who was a major investor in slavery. But of course, Rostad makes his donation in the late 1700s. Oh, sorry, I'm confusing. He makes his donation in the late 1600s, and Coleridge is here in the late 1700s. So already that donation is 100 years old. So you can say that it's old slave money already when Coleridge studies here in the 1790s. Okay, I want to fast forward a few years. Coleridge left Cambridge in 1795 and moved to Bristol together with his friend Robert Southey, who you see here. And I don't know if this portrait seems similar to one I just showed you of Coleridge. I think this is a little bit creepy. This is not accidental. Southey and Coleridge became super besties. What happened is Coleridge one summer decided to go to Wales on a walking tour. And on the way to Wales, they went via Oxford, he and his friend Hux. They went via Oxford, where they were supposed to stay for a couple of days. But Coleridge met Southey, and the rest is history. They ended up staying there for 3 weeks because it was just impossible to get Coleridge away from him. And by the time they left, Coleridge and Southey had this new plan. They're going to go together to America, to Susquehanna, where they're going to start a new utopian community and they called it Pantisocracy. And Pantisocracy, I think, is a particularly unfortunate term, but it came from the Greek, denoting that everyone would have equal rule, so that everyone would be deciding together, again, thinking about democratic principles. So after meeting Southey, Coleridge actually left Jesus, and that's part of the reason why he didn't graduate, because he was so busy pursuing the Pantisocratic ideal. But first they needed money. And how did he get money? Well, he decided to do some lecturing in Bristol, where Southey was from. So Coleridge and Southey collaborated on a series of lectures, and one of these was on the slave trade. So Coleridge gave a lecture on the slave trade as part of this money-raising venture for the Pantisocratic scheme. Now, doing so, he went to the library to borrow some books. This ledger is from Bristol Central Library, or Bristol Library Society at the time, where Coleridge and Southey were both members. As you can see, it's a much neater object than the undergraduate ledger. Here you can see, this is, maybe the more eagle-eyed of you can see that on the 15th of June, 1796, Coleridge takes out Thomas Clarkson's On the Policy of the Slave Trade and a book called On Colonization by the Swedish traveler Wadström. This is reading to help him prepare for the lecture that he was going to deliver the following day. So it's better late than never. So again, what's interesting is to look at these ledgers to be able to trace Coleridge's reading. And actually, it's not that he plagiarizes, but he does use his sources a lot. And I think it's really fascinating being in those same libraries today when you can still look at the books, the very books that he borrowed. By the time Coleridge borrowed Clarkson's book, Clarkson was already a prominent abolitionist. Here's an image of Thomas Clarkson. He studied at St. John's College, also in Cambridge, in the 1780s, and he also won a prize for an essay in Latin, whose topic was given, and that topic was the immorality of slavery. So again, an indication of the abolitionist sentiments around this university. After leaving university, so the interesting thing about Clarkson is he wrote this essay because he was given the topic, right, about slavery, and then he convinced himself that this is so bad, I need to devote the rest of my life to combating slavery, which is a quite amazing conversion. So after leaving university, he helped co-found the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, and he set out to gather hard evidence about the horrors of the slave trade. So he wanted to argue that the slave trade is just horrible for everyone involved. First, he went to talk to merchants and captains, but soon he found no one wants to talk to me. And then he changed tack and he turned to the sailors. This was something quite unprecedented. In the age of sail, the sailors formed a global proletariat working under often very dangerous and unwholesome conditions to facilitate the global expansion of both trade and military conquest. So sailors were essential workers, and yet they were also at the very bottom of the maritime hierarchy. Clarkson did something radically anti-authoritarian when he listened to their stories and treated their testimony seriously, and then translated them into a series of forceful arguments heard by politicians and the wider public. Because before Clarkson, no one would really take these people seriously because they were seen as being so low down on the social hierarchy. Now, the book that Coleridge borrows is this one, an essay on the impolicy of the African slave trade. And it really takes aim at the impolicy of the trade, that is, that it fails to make rational business sense. An important pro-slavery argument that Clarkson had to contend with was that the transatlantic slave trade was the cradle or the nursery of British seamen, which linked the slave trade to national pride in Britain's maritime ascendancy. A slave trade ship, or a Guineaman, as they were called at the time, because Africa was known as Guinea, would aim to depart. So a Guineaman would often depart Britain with a crew at least twice as large as that on a merchant ship of a comparable size sailing to India. For this reason, slavery defenders would say that the slave trade took on and trained many novice sailors, thus offering a training ground for sailors who had gone to work elsewhere in the global machinery of shipping. But even on its own terms, this argument should raise suspicions. Why did slave ships have such large crews? And why did sailors who had once sailed in the slave trade wish to escape to other branches? Now, the surplus manning was required not to keep the captured Africans in check, but as an insurance against the extremely high mortality on these voyages, caused by the unsanitary conditions on a slave ship, where people were crammed together in the hold without adequate sanitary facilities. And of course, there were also tropical diseases encountered in Africa and the Caribbean, for which many British sailors had low immunity, as well as the malnourishment of shipboard life, because they still hadn't understood vitamin D deficiency, so scurvy was basically a universal condition of all sailors. So what Clarkson does here is basically go in great detail and great length to just explain how horrible life is for British sailors on slave ships. Again, the argument puts the British sailors first, and then the question of what happens to the Africans is that comes later. That's a bit of a side effect. Now, Anne lingered on this context of thinking about conditions for slave trade sailors because they form an important background to my reading of Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is one of his more famous poems. This is an illustration by Gustave Doré from the late 19th century. Coleridge wrote The Rime of the Ancient Mariner in 1797, and so he began in 1797, which is a year after he had given that lecture on the slave trade. In what follows, I want to suggest that the poem is an allegory on the trade. The plot is fairly well known. At the outset, you have a person who's going to a wedding. He's being interrupted by an old man, the ancient mariner. The poem's opening lines, I'm sure many of you know by heart. It is an ancient mariner, and he stopped at one of three. By thy long grey beard and thy glittering eye, now wherefore stoppest me? The wedding guest asks. It soon becomes clear that the mariner has stopped him to impart his story of his experiences at sea, how he set sail and travelled southwards, how somewhere close to the South Pole they encountered an albatross that began following their ship. The mariners shot the bird, and this brought a curse upon the ship. And there's an image of the mariner. Eventually, they hang the dead albatross around his neck in punishment for shooting the bird. In the course of the voyage, all the shipmates die, and the mariner is the sole survivor, so he ends up being alone with his dead albatross around his neck. My basic point is that the mariner is sailing on a Guineaman, a slave ship. The first hint is a suspiciously large crew. 4 times 50 living men is the crew that mans the ship when they set out. This calculation alone suggests a slaver, because as already noted, slavers sail with unusually large crews to account for the excess mortality among sailors. Even those who didn't die on the voyage but made it back home alive often did so in a wretched state. More than one commentator, such as Clarkson, referred to the emaciated and disease-ridden sailors returned home from the Middle Passage as walking ghosts or resurrected dead men. I would say this explains the fate of the mariners' fellow sailors, who all die and are resurrected in the course of the narrative. Here's one such scene. So basically, when sailors came back, they looked more dead than alive. And the way in which the ship is sailed by men who are more dead than alive would be Coleridge's poetic example of what sailors look like. Beneath the lightning and the moon, the dead men gave a groan. They groaned, they stirred, they all uprose, ne spake, ne moved their eyes. It had been strange, even in a dream, to have seen those dead men rise. The helmsman steered, the ship moved on, yet never a breeze blew. The mariners all gan work the ropes, where they were wont to do. They raised their limbs like lifeless tools. We were a ghastly crew. This may sound supernatural, but it's probably a psychologically accurate depiction of a slave trade sailor's experience. And again, Coleridge lived in Bristol, which is one of the major slaving ports. It's also quite likely they would have encountered sailors coming off the ships firsthand. So disease was one important cause for excess mortality among sailors, but not the only one. The second one was insurrection, when the captive Africans, rose up and killed the crew. Newspapers frequently reported on ghost ships discovered adrift in the mid-Atlantic, either completely empty or with only a handful of half-dead men on board. Such is the case of an American schooner that was discovered a year after leaving Rhode Island for a slaving exhibition to Africa. When found, the ship was without sails, without crew, and with only a handful of Africans in a very emaciated and wretched condition. Most likely they had risen and killed the ship's crew, but without the navigational skills to sail back to Africa, they must have drifted with the winds and tides, slowly starving to death. And there are many such stories, which is kind of very sad to think that there's an attempt at emancipation and then ends up with just a slow death at sea. With that in mind, I want to turn to the appearance of the spectre ship in Coleridge's poem. This scene takes place shortly after the mariner has shot the albatross, and suddenly a ship appears on the horizon and comes towards them. Alas, thought I, and my heart beat loud, how fast she nears and nears. But I particularly want to focus on the final 2 lines in this quote, where he asks, so looking at the ship, comes towards him and only sees two figures on it. And are those 2 all the crew, that woman and her fleshless fear? So this is a ship with 2 passengers, a woman and her fear. Fear is an archaic word for companion or partner. Now this is not as fantastic as may appear at first sight. As I mentioned, slaving was a dangerous business, and whoever was sailing along the Atlantic triangular route would sooner or later come face to face with abandoned or near abandoned slave ships, spectre barks to use Coleridge's term, whose crews and captives had been decimated by either disease or insurrection. John Newton, if you remember the slave trader turned evangelical Christian, just kind of introduced him at the outset, had the following to say about onboard insurrections. These, referring to insurrections, are always meditated, for the men slaves are not easily reconciled to their confinement and treatment. And if attempted, they are seldom suppressed without considerable loss, and sometimes they succeed to the destruction of a whole ship's company at once, which is to say when the captives manage to kill the whole ship's crew in one go. Seldom a year passes, but we hear of 1 or more such catastrophes. And we likewise hear sometimes of whites and blacks involved in one moment in one common ruin by the gunpowder taking fire and blowing up the ship. So if you're sailing on these routes, what you will encounter frequently is stories of ships where either everyone is dead or the whole ship has been destroyed, or indeed encounter just the empty abandoned ship. Coleridge was familiar with such accounts from his reading of abolitionist literature and potentially also from meeting sailors in Bristol, and I think it's quite clear that this ship with 2 passengers is one of those those accounts are modeled for his ship with 2 passengers. This also explains the racialized depiction of the fleshless sphere that comes in the following stanza. So there are 2 passengers, one of them is this. His bones were black with many a crack, all black and bare I ween. Jet black and bare, say where with rust, of mouldy damps and charnel crust, are patched with purple and green. This jet black, skinny, naked and wounded man is, I would say, very clearly an enslaved African, covered with open sores from his confinement in the hold. And open wounds are quite a prominent theme in a lot of abolitionist literature that always thrived on the very graphic depictions of black suffering. Coleridge deftly filters this account through the aesthetics of racial contrast, and the fierce blackness is used to set off his companion's whiteness. So this is the second passenger, a woman. Her lips are red, her looks are free, her locks are yellow as gold. Her skin is white as leprosy, and she is far liker death than he. Her flesh makes the still air cold. The golden blonde hair and rosy lips signal her racial status as white. And note how Coleridge links these racial characteristics to looking free. Her looks are free. This is written at a time when blackness was being increasingly identified with enslavability. To be black meant to be a slave. And of course, the reverse holds true. To be white means to be free. But where whiteness, in addition to freedom, usually denotes fairness, with the attendant virtues of purity and innocence, here the woman's whiteness signals disease. Her leprosy is at once a metaphor for the moral stain of slavers, as well as the bodily disfigurements of slave trade crews, who are often victim to both malnourishment and tropical diseases, as I've already mentioned. So the point I want to make is that the Rime of the Ancient Mariner contains many direct references to the slave trade, references that were quite legible to his contemporary readers, even if they have been forgotten in the 200 years since it was written. His friend Robert Southey, again, is someone who clearly saw this as a poem on the slave trade. Shortly after it appeared, Southey wrote a very vicious review in which he attacked the Ancient Mariner for being absurd and unintelligible. In his review, he writes, "We do not sufficiently understand the story to analyze it," and dismisses the poem as a Dutch attempt at German sublimity. Genius has here been employed in producing a poem of little merit. So that's quite harsh words, and Coleridge was obviously upset when his bestie writes something like that and publishes it in a newspaper. Nonetheless, Southey immediately, this like the following months, went on to plagiarize the Ancient Mariner. He wrote a poem that uses the same ballad form as Coleridge had, and also borrowed the central plot device of a seaman who's been traumatized by his experience at sea and seeks to unburden himself to an unwitting stranger. Here the similarities end. Southey avoids any metaphysical obscurities to present the central crime in an intelligible, straightforward manner. Already the title spells it out. Southey's poem is called The Sailor Who Had Served in the Slave Trade. Reading the 2 poems side by side helps us understand why Southey attacked the Ancient Mariner. Basically, he produced a version with the same plot, which is a straightforward abolitionist piece of propaganda. And so therefore also the crime, because in Coleridge he shoots a bird, and somehow that shooting of the albatross becomes his sin that haunts him. In Southey, the sin is, narrated here. So this is from Southey's poem. This is the sailor confessing on his back in Britain. "I sailed on board a Guineaman, and to the slave coast went. Would that the sea had swallowed me when I was innocent. And we took in our cargo there, 300 Negro slave, and we sailed homeward merrily over the ocean waves. But some were sulky of the slaves and would not touch their meat, and therefore we were forced by threats and blows to make them eat." So basically, they have to beat the captive Africans to make them eat, and he ends up beating a woman to death. So she refuses to eat, and he flogs her until she dies, and that is the crime. So this is the killing that is the sin that haunts the sailor, which is quite straightforward. He murdered someone. He feels bad about it now. It's quite blunt, and I think the contrast between the two poems reveal why Coleridge is the better poet. Rather than have the spectacle of someone being beaten to death, guilt is generated by the much more suggestive shooting of an albatross, and we might sort of wonder what exactly the sin consists in. Nonetheless, Southey was not the only person to attack the Ancient Mariner for its obscurities, and Coleridge himself was haunted by the sense that the poem is quite difficult to get to grips with. He revised the poem, and he went on to also add some marginal annotations that allegedly explained what the poem was about. I want to return to that scene with the spectre bark in a revision that he made in 1816 and then subsequent versions. Just want to compare the first version to the revised version, which you have here. So this is the same scene we've just been looking at. The ship appears. It has a crew of 2 people, a white woman and a black man. So in the first stanza, you have the question, are those 2 all her crew? In the revised version, that is replaced with, is that woman all her crew? So what happens is that the fleshless sphere, the black man, is replaced with a much more disembodied and epistemically uncertain figure. Is that a death, he asks, leaving it quite unclear whether the spectre ship has 1 or 2 passengers. Are there 2? Even more strikingly, this blank in the middle is that central stanza, which had this graphic depiction of a black wounded body, is completely gone. And in the final stanza, we had that contrast between the black man and the white woman and her being far liker death than he, is replaced with an assertion, the nightmare life and death was she. So basically the black man completely disappears. This is an act of erasure, of course, a revisionist process that mimics the way in which the reality of slavery has been written out of Britain's cultural memory, that tends to focus on white abolitionism and erase black resistance, as well as the black suffering that paid for British prosperity. But this act of erasure, the removal of the black man, also testifies to Coleridge's changing opinions as he moved away from his early abolitionist sentiments. Because the sad fact is that the older he got, the more racist that Coleridge become. I'm going to illustrate this by giving you an example from his reading of Shakespeare's Othello. This is Edmund Kean, a romantic era actor, playing Othello in blackface. I'm going to talk a little bit about another series of lectures that Coleridge gave, this time on Shakespeare. So again, actually, this is in the 1810s. Coleridge is in need of money again, and what do? You give lectures. So he delivered a series of lectures on Shakespeare in both London and Bristol. Because he didn't really write his lectures, it's hard to reconstruct quite what he said, but there are some evidences, for instance, newspaper reports. On the 11th of November 1813, the Bristol Gazette reported about Coleridge's lecture on Shakespeare that took place in Bristol. Mr. C, that is Coleridge, ridiculed the idea of making Othello a Negro. He, meaning Othello, was a gallant Moor of royal blood, combining a high sense of Spanish and Italian feeling, whose noble nature was wrought upon, not by fellow, well, the rest is about Iago. The key point here is the argument that the notion of Othello being a Negro is ridiculous. Now, the word Moor refers to Africans, both North Africans of Arab or Berber heritage, as well as Black Africans from the sub-Saharan regions. Coleridge argued that even though stage tradition, ever since Shakespeare's time in fact, had represented Othello as a Black African, Shakespeare must have imagined him as a North African, either Arab or Berber. This is because Coleridge is certain that Black Africans are not capable of such gallant and noble feelings as manifested by Othello. And also, of course, the Moors ruled Spain for quite a long period, almost 800 years in the medieval period, which is why Coleridge attributes Othello's gallant and noble qualities to Spanish and Italian feeling. So he even removes the North African. It's only sort of the Spanish feeling that remains that makes Othello great. Now, this is not a momentary blip, and this newspaper report seems to have been quite accurate because it goes with what Coleridge says elsewhere. So this is 1813. At the end of the decade, in 1819, he gave a lecture devoted to Othello at the Crown and Anchor pub on the Strand in London. The contents of this lecture have been transmitted by his nephew, Henry Nelson Coleridge, who published a summary of it based on Coleridge's own notes, some of which are now lost. But here I find Coleridge again expanding on the argument that Shakespeare could not have intended Othello to be a Black African. Can we suppose him, Shakespeare that is, so utterly ignorant as to make a barbarous Negro plead royal birth? Were Negroes then known better slaves? It is a common error to mistake the epithets applied by the dramatis personae to each other as truly descriptive of what the audience ought to see or know. Skipping ahead a bit. As we are constituted, right? He himself, another Englishman of his time, and most surely as an English audience was disposed at the beginning of the 17th century, when Othello was written, it would be something monstrous to conceive this beautiful Venetian girl falling in love with a veritable Negro. It would argue a disproportionateness, a want of balance, in Desdemona, which Shakespeare does not appear to have in the least contemplated. So Coleridge here identifies black skin with being a slave. This means that it's incompatible with the royal birth, that Othello is of royal birth in the play, but also with the feelings, again, of nobility and gallantry associated with the character. Furthermore, it is monstrous, he says, that a beautiful white woman would fall in love with a black man of any description. This would unbalance or unhinge the dramatic structure of the play, and balance is quite a key term in Coleridge's aesthetics. He's interested in the organic unity of works and how all the different parts of a drama hang together. This want of balance between a white woman and a black man may well be the reason why he wrote that black man out of his poem. And again, this is the 1810s, so at the same time he revises the Ancient Mariner, he comes up with this interpretation of Othello. This also testifies to the entanglement between racist ideas and aesthetic principles. It is, of course, racism that dictates that a love affair between a white woman and a black man is some form of transgression or monstrosity, in Coleridge's term. And this, again, why I'm interested in how racist ideas affect literary and artistic works. Now, one key tenet of 18th century thought of aesthetics was the question of how to define beauty. In the 18th century, they liked taxonomies, like to number and rank everything. And they're into empiricism. Beauty seems to be an empirical fact. It's out there in the world. And yet, how do we know that something is beautiful? That seems to be a subjective judgment. I can think that green is beautiful while you like blue, someone else might like red or yellow. Yet everyone could agree that black skin is ugly and white skin is beautiful. So it follows that Europeans are beautiful and Africans are ugly. That's self-evident. But the philosophical question we would pursue, is whether this ideal of beauty was culturally specific to Europe or universal. In other words, do Africans also consider white skin to be more beautiful than black skin? Some would say that Africans find their own black skin to be more beautiful and use that as an argument to prove that Africans lack even the capacity for understanding beauty. Coleridge believed something else. For him, beauty and whiteness were inextricably linked. In one of his notebooks, he comments on this fact. Well, fact, he calls it. Curious fact mentioned to me that Negroes often console themselves in their cruel punishments. So referring to when black people are being punished, particularly whippings in plantations. So they console themselves that their wounds would become white. So the notion would be that when the scars heal, that would be a white scar. And they console themselves with that. And they consider this as a grand progression on the rank of nature, spite of their abhorrence of the cruelty of white men. Their love of white, their belief that superior beings are white, even in the inmost parts of Africa, where they have seen no white man, it is a color beloved by their good deities and by supreme of all, the men to whom they do not pray, but whose existence they confess. This, among so many others, in favor of permanent principles of beauty. So again, the notion is that whiteness is so superior that even Africans in the heart of Africa who have never seen a white person would consider a white person to be more beautiful than anyone else. So, as I said, Coleridge does become more racist as he ages. But nonetheless, I don't think the fact that he has certain unpalatable opinions, and I certainly would not want to necessarily have dinner with him in this period of his life, his poetry is still valuable. His poetry is still inspiring. That's the word I'll choose. So I think there's a kind of, we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Even though you might dislike some of the racist ideas, I think we still appreciate the poetry, particularly what it says about its time, but also the role it has played for other subsequent poets. And so I want to finish with a glance on a more recent adaptation of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, by the contemporary poet Tiana Clark. And that's the cover of the book. The poem is called The Rime of Nina Simone, and the collection is called I Can't Talk About the Trees Without the Blood. That's reference to the trees in the southern US, often used for lynchings. So she says she can't talk about how beautiful trees are without remembering the history of people who have died. Something similar goes to me. I can't talk about Romanticism without remembering the dark side of the history. I also want to show this cover because it's a black woman, and after I've shown you quite a lot of dead white men, so just kind of a black woman is due. It is a portrait of the jazz singer Nina Simone by Terence Hayes. And this portrait is also part of the inspiration for the poem. Now, in Clark's poem, The Rime of Nina Simone takes the place of the ancient mariner. She replaces him in a narrative that tells the trauma of the middle passage from the reverse perspective. As you may recall, before the rhyme itself, there's an argument, so a summary of the poem in Coleridge, and Clark mirrors that. So Coleridge explains his poem is about how a ship passed the line of that's of the tropic, was driven by storms to the cold country towards the South Pole, and from then she made her course to tropical latitude of well, I don't need to read it all. All I want to say is that how Clark is taking that same structure, but he writes it in a different way. Here it is how a slave ship was driven by capitalism and racism. He talks about the triangle of the transatlantic slave trade. And here have Nina Simone coming back instead of the ancient mariner coming back. So the two poems deal with the same history, but from opposite perspectives, and that's what really interests me. Where Coleridge centers on the plight of white sailors, Clark foregrounds the captive black women. These are the lines from her opening, and here again is the portrait. I didn't recognize her at first, but felt urgency inside her glittering eyes, grotesque and morganite, melting blooms. Her skin stabbed with hammered copper, afro-nimbus, the luminous gaze and X-rays swishing at my skin with metronomic waves. Time-worn but regal, her spine made of satin and salt, her bolted black back clutching every battle-born ballad, a lone column of glissandos and thunder snow, booming and bright. Come here, she says. This rehearses the opening of The Ancient Mariner, where the mariner arrests and holds a wedding guest with his glittering eye. But instead of a wedding guest, we get the first-person narrator, the poet herself, waylaid on her way to a seminar. Both the wedding guest and the student are made to witness the atrocities of the slave trade. The poem deals with the pain of history, but in a way that is empowering of black women, placing them at the center of the narrative. As I said, I take inspiration from this. I'm invested in a close study of archival documents in order to uncover the workings of race in the Romantic period, but I'm also interested in creative attempts to rework that history to bring out perspectives so painfully absent from the archives. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Mathelinda, that was fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone.
So many brilliant things there, and so many different things we love to go into. I mean, I've never thought of the rhyme of the ancient mariner like that before, or sadly the way Coleridge changed in some ways. We do have time for a number of questions, and if you're here, just put your hand up, we'll come to you. If you're online, please type it in and I'll come here. Can I start us off there with one question? You talked about a couple of people who'd written things in response to set essays. What questions should we be setting now?
Oh, wow. That's above my